2. Welcome everybody to the AAFLFC podcast. I am honored to have, and it's my pleasure to have today with me as my guest, David Vermette. David Vermette is a researcher, a writer, and speaker on the history and identity of the descendants of French North America. He was born and raised in Massachusetts. And really, David needs no introduction, I know. He is the author of A Distinct Alien Race, the untold story of Franco-Americans, industrialization, immigration, religious strife. And I know it's an important book. I have read it and read it carefully and read parts of it, and it is truly important work. He's also the author of numerous articles and blog posts and is a frequent speaker on Franco-American history and culture. David, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very, very happy to be here.
David, please tell us about how you first became interested in advocacy for the French language and Francophone culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely more focused on the history and culture part of it. It's really because this is my heritage. It's really that simple. I had 4 grandparents who spoke French who were of Quebecois or Acadian ancestry. Right at the very beginning of my book, I tell a story about what was sort of a catalytic event for me in becoming interested in this. And that was the fact that my father died when he was fairly young and I was fairly young. I was 19 years old. And I remember going up to the cemetery in Maine where he was buried. My family lived near Boston. And yet he was buried with my mom's family, which was in Biddeford, Maine, which was a majority French-speaking community at one point. And I remember going up there, and in the cemetery, all of the gravestones, almost all of them, were in French. You know, all of the writing on these gravestones was in French. Almost everyone had a French name. And at that time, I didn't know a lot. I knew our family is French Canadian. We had visited Montreal when I was a kid. I mean, I knew something about it. We actually had, in retrospect, quite a few customs and cultural features that were very typical of the French Canadian, the traditional French Canadian and Acadian cultures. But at that time, I wasn't very much aware of it as a very young person. So this was a catalytic event that really made me aware of the fact that my family belonged to something much larger that I didn't really know a lot about. So at that time, as a college student, I did some reading. I did some background reading on the history of Quebec and on Franco-Americans, such as was available at that time. And I discovered some books and some resources that I was able to come back to later. And then I kind of got involved in other things in my life. And every couple of years, I'd come back to this project of research. And then right around the turn of the millennium, right after 2000, I visited Prince Edward Island, where my grandmother was from, and that really was a catalytic event. And also my sister had become really interested in our family history. So I became really interested in exploring particularly my roots in Quebec. My sister was really interested in those Acadian roots. So I became interested in these Quebecois roots. And really ever since then, I really became involved very heavily in this historical research to uncover this community. As we've talked about a little bit before, I was particularly interested in the fact that nobody seemed to know much about this immigrant influx. It was largely an untold story. So, you know, after a number of years of research, people started saying you should write a book. So, I started a blog, and that was sort of research and development, and that actually the blog attracted the interest of a publisher, and I ended up publishing my book. And since then, I've been on this round of speaking and writing and receiving invitations like this one to participate in this podcast. And so it's been a great ride and a very rewarding experience for me.
Wow. And thank you from all of us that you did actually take that step and write those books and step up your involvement. Please tell us about your research and your work as a writer and speaker.
Yeah, well, my experience might be a little bit different than some other folks who become interested in family or community research, because I was a researcher and a writer really before I became seriously engaged in this research. As I mentioned, I began way back in college. That was a really long time ago. But then subsequently, I developed a career as a researcher and as a freelance writer. And that gave me the skills, the research chops to be able to really go out there and do some serious research and uncover some things that maybe people haven't uncovered before. So I had a small number of academic citations for research that I had done in unrelated areas before I really got seriously engaged in this topic again around the year 2000. So I was bringing to it a background as a writer and a researcher, particularly in quantitative research, doing surveys and crunching the numbers and creating databases. So if you read my book, you'll notice it has a very quantitative basis. That comes right out of my professional research. So I would say that quantitative research does characterize the type of research that I do. I would also say my research has a somewhat different orientation than some of the previous books and fine researchers who have worked in this field, insofar as a lot of their work was very much on local history or regional history. They told the story of the French Canadians in New England, and that's really my focus. It's the French Canadians and Acadians of New England. They told that story as a regional history only, as if it had no connection almost to the other trends in the history of the United States. But in fact, I found that the influx of French Canadians to New England was a national news story in its day. And it's at the heyday of that immigration movement, which was really the 20 years between 1880 and 1900. This was a national news story. It was covered by national news publications. It was discussed on a national level. It was discussed in papers and publications all over the country as a serious event in the immigration history of this country. And this goes to the subtitle of my book, Industrialization, Immigration, Religious Strife, because these are three areas that, if you want to talk about the American history of industrialization, of immigration or religious conflict, you will have to talk about the French Canadian influx. It's really necessary to talk about that as one of the important episodes in terms of these three themes in American history. So on both sides of the border, this history has been ignored for different reasons. One is that when people left French Canada and they came to the United States, as far as French Canadian history is concerned, they become part of American history. On the US side of the border, anything that's about so-called French Canadians must be about Canada, right? So it was never accepted on either side of the border as a part of the historical narrative in either country. And I think that's one of the really important elements in the fact that this story is an untold story, is the fact that neither side of the border wanted to claim it as their own. And in fact, it is a cross-border story. It's a transnational story, not dissimilar to what's going on our southwestern border right now, right? There is a transnational story of Latinos in North America. They don't only live in Mexico or in some other country or in Puerto Rico. It bleeds into the history of the United States. It makes the regions that have been affected, like Miami and South Florida, or West Texas or Southern California, part of this broader transnational story. So I'm trying to create that same sense for this French Canadian and Acadian story, that this is a transnational identity and it's a transnational story.
I was very impressed immediately by both the depth of your research, those great articles, those articles from the New York Times early on, many, many others. And I was also impressed by the scope of your resources and really the way you really attached, in a sense, the story of French Canadians and Franco-Americans to other broader societal trends. It really does make your book unique and even more important than it would have been otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, please share your thoughts, if you would, on, and I know you said earlier you're more interested in Francophone culture than on French language per se, but I have to admit, to some extent, they walk together, varying extents. But share your thoughts on the role and status of French language and Francophone culture today in North America and in the U.S.
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak to the other regions like Louisiana or maybe the upper Midwest where there are Francophone or Francophone culture people, but I can speak to the situation in the Northeast, particularly in the New England region. And, there is a controversial issue that's kind of come up, and it's something that organizations like yours can help to understand better. And that's the fact that the Franco-American identity, as we call it in New England, is no longer today a linguistic identity. It's based on shared history and shared experience and family and community connections. That's really what it's based on, more than speaking French. Because the fact is, it's only a small percentage of the population of descendants who are bilingual. So when I say that, we have to understand that that doesn't mean I discount the importance of that language in our history, or I discount the importance of bilingualism, or that I discount the loss that was, the significant loss that was when people lost their heritage language. These are very, very important things. But we can actually acknowledge two things, and we can thread the needle. We have to thread the needle in a very fine way. And one of the ways that we do that is to acknowledge that today, the Franco-American identity in New England is no longer really a linguistic identity. It's become separated from that. And at the same time, we support very strongly the continuation of the French language in the places where it exists today. And we also very much support the revival of French language among the descendants in New England. So what I'm seeing today that's really important is it used to be 20 years ago when I started going to Franco-American conferences, knowledge of French was directly proportional to age. The older you were, the more likely you were to have some French. The younger you were, the less likely you were to have some French. Now I find that's no longer true. I find a lot of younger Franco-American people, French Canadian, Acadian descendants in New England now speak French. They've gone to school, they've studied, they've realized the importance of preserving that. So I think that we really do have hope for a revival of even the French language in New England in the form of younger people who are being engaged. And I think this is why the work you're doing is really important. And I think the work that I'm doing to make this history understandable and important, feel important for younger people. It's the story unfortunately has been told as some old musty relic of things that happened ages ago that happened to your great grandparents, and they're no longer relevant anymore. It's just reflecting perhaps nostalgically on some past event. I don't think we should relate to our story in that way. It's not just some old musty thing that's relevant to your great grandparents. It's relevant today. It's relevant to the history of the United States. It's relevant to the immigrant experiences that people are having today. And part of that is indeed the revival of the language. So, we have to have the subtlety to understand that more than one thing can be happening at the same time. Though many people have lost their language, and we have to acknowledge that that's just a fact. I'm reminded that the French Canadian Legacy podcast, I know you know those folks well, they had to come out with a statement in French because they were getting nasty notes that said you're all fake because your podcasts are in English, and therefore you're somehow fraudulent, or what you're doing is fake. They had to come out with a statement in French to justify what they were doing. What that attitude does not understand is that if that podcast were in French, it would speak to a tiny sliver of a percentage of a population of people in New England, right? So it wouldn't have any impact. It has to be in English for now. It has to be. We have to be able to talk about French Canadian stories in English and have that be legitimate on this side of the border. I understand that people on the other side of the border, that's very triggering. They hear English, they'll start breaking out in hives. But the reality is, here on this side of the border, we have to use English. It just is the fact of the matter. We can't dodge it. We have to be able to do that in order to move people to having a greater engagement with their history and culture. Then if they do that, then they might be motivated to learn French. And that's my experience. I didn't grow up with French in the home. My grandparents and their generation spoke French. I grew up with English in the home, but I went and learned French. And I granted my first interview in French to Radio Canada a few weeks ago. And I was able to do that just, learning it as an adult and listening to the language and studying. I was moved to do that by deeply identifying with my culture and history. But if somebody at the very beginning of my research said, no, unless you do it all in French, it's not legitimate, I wouldn't have never have got there. So I think this is an extremely important point that we have to make. And that when we put all of the emphasis on language, we can sometimes leave people out, who speak English but want to become engaged.
I agree with really everything that you've just said. I wish I could say it as well, but thank you. For the record, I have to say I do think folks at the French Canadian Legacy podcast and blog are doing a wonderful, wonderful job.
They're incredible.
They really are terrific.
They are amazing. They do an amazing job. I really support them. I've been on there twice, I think, or maybe 3 times. They do an amazing job. They're doing really important work by gathering all of these voices together. No one has done that in, I don't know if ever, maybe, I don't know, or, not in a very long time has anyone gathered together all of those voices. So yes, I think the work that they're doing is immensely important, and it's a gateway to the French language, for a lot of people.
I think that is that sense of the importance of inclusion is very important, and possibly, as you say, engaging people in an active interest and participation in the culture. It could awaken or reawaken interest in acquiring French, or maybe reacquiring some French that may have been partly or almost totally forgotten. So I think that is absolutely what you're saying is absolutely true for so many of us.
Yeah, and if I just might add one more thing, I think
Sure.
that that's what's going on right now in New England. Is there's starting to be some kind of reawakening. It's really, we don't know where it's going to go. It could all fizzle out. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? But there is an awakening of interest in this among younger people. Like I say, it's not just people over 55 anymore. We have a whole generation of younger people who are identifying with being Franco-American, many of whom are reconnecting with the language and reconnecting with the history, and it's wonderful to see.
I agree. Now, my next question, you've covered parts of this, but if there's anything you'd like to add, I'd be very much appreciative. And while French language and Francophone culture are present throughout the U.S., the New England states and Louisiana are among the areas with the highest percentage of people with French heritage. How do you envision the future? And I know you mentioned earlier you really that New England is, of course, your home, and the area that really you are most interested in and most knowledgeable about. But how do you envision the future in New England and in any way beyond? I touched on the fact that you've seen signs of a revival among the young, and of course that's so important. The young, they are the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think Louisiana is doing really well. I think that there's been a revival down there for sure of the language. They've got Tele Louisiane, and they've got immersion schools, and they've identified with that very strongly. I think in terms of the language, New England is a little bit lagging behind in not having fewer official resources. A lot of the activity that's going on in New England right now is in the grassroots level. I'm working without any institutional support. I'm an independent researcher and scholar. The French Canadian Legacy podcast, it is an independent, effort. You have a lot of these sort of grassroots independents and individuals who are out there becoming activists. So it doesn't have a lot of official support. But I think we just have to let this revival, or whatever we're calling it, play out. We have to allow this to play out and see where it's going to go. And I think that the current interest in general throughout the country and throughout the continent in identity, the question of identity. This is a pressing concern for young people. And this is bringing people into the fold, as it were, of becoming interested in the Franco-American identity. So I think the more that we discuss these questions that interest young people, the more that we reveal and uncover the Francophone culture that existed in New England at one time, the more we connect people to this history and culture, the more we will see interest in the language and the history and the culture. I think it's cumulative. So my sort of unsatisfying answer is we got to keep doing what we're doing. What you're doing, what I'm doing, what French Canadian Legacy Podcast is doing. We have to keep doing more of the same, because from what I can see, it's working. Because I'll tell you why I think that. It's anecdotal, but nonetheless interesting, is that I've had an enormous correspondence from my book. I mean, hardly, certainly a week doesn't go by, but hardly a couple days, goes by that I don't hear from somebody. Somebody sends me a letter through the mail, somebody sends me an email, somebody writes a comment on my blog. And these comments come from people from age 20 to age 90. I've seen the complete age range of people who have commented on this book. And so it seems to me that it struck a nerve. Something about it has struck a nerve in people, because the response has really been tremendous and overwhelmingly positive. Frankly, I expected to get a lot more negative feedback on my book than I actually got. I thought parts of it were quite controversial and I might get some nasty grams, from people. But in fact, almost all of the feedback is positive, and it's large. I hear quite a bit. So something is stirring. And so, I think in terms of New England, we just have to keep on trucking, and keep on doing the things that we're doing.
Understood. Understood. Thank you. Now, a final question, and I know you've spoken about the resurgence of French, the reacquisition of French by younger people. And I have to admit, as a parent, I'm always interested in bilingualism and how we can encourage the learning and use of another language or more than one additional language in the home. Would there be anything additional that you'd like to share about how we can encourage in our homes and in our families, in our communities, the use of French?
Yeah, I would say I have more cautionary words. I have more words about what not to do than what to do. But one of the things I would say not to do is to stigmatize people's French or English. I think, like I said, the use of English to tell French Canadian type stories to a predominantly English speaking audience, there's a certain contingent out there that thinks that's illegitimate. They're essentially stigmatizing the use of English to tell, Francophone cultural stories. I think that's a shame. And another thing I see is that frequently North American varieties of French are stigmatized. They're dirty French, that's not good French. My sister was told by the high school teacher in French that my grandmother's French was not real French. My grandmother lived with us. We had a native Francophone living in our home, and I heard hardly a word of French, because of the stigmatization of that language. My grandmother herself would say, oh, my languages aren't so good, and, high school teachers were saying, oh, that's not real French. So we continue to hear that stigmatization. I got a couple of nasty comments on YouTube videos I had from people saying, French Canadian French isn't real French. It's a lousy language. Why are you bothering to promote this? And I've even had Quebec people, when I say, that I learned French with a Quebec accent because that's what I would have learned had my parents taught me. I've had people say, why did you want to learn that? That's bad French, right? So, this stigmatization must stop. I think that's exceedingly important. And also to just have enormous patience with people, particularly adults, adults who are learning languages. You're talking about children growing up in a bilingual home, but now we have many people in New England who are adults who want to learn French, and it's very difficult. I know, as an adult, essentially learning French, it's a very difficult thing to do. So we need to have extreme patience. Another thing I would like to see is I would like to see Quebec get more involved in having programs for Franco-American people, for French Canadian descendants. There should be set-asides. There should be programs for people, either children or adults, who want to learn this language a la Quebec. I think the Quebec government could get a lot more involved in things like that if they want to promote French in North America generally, which seems to be their intent. If they want to preserve their French in Quebec, it can't just be a fortress, with circling the wagons around it. There has to be outreach to these other communities, because there are 2 million French Canadian descendants in New England, right? It's a large group. Most of them do not speak French, but they are a natural resource for Quebec. This is something the Quebecois don't realize. They've got this natural resource. It's untapped. It's like a pool of oil. Imagine a huge untapped pool of oil just waiting for somebody to tap into it and make $1 million, right? There's this untapped natural resource there. And we, Franco-Americans, have a responsibility to make our friends in Quebec and also in the former Acadia to know about that. And I think this is an important way to promote the French language and bilingualism for both adults and children, ultimately.
I have to admit, I was fortunate enough, I was blessed to be able to go to school in Quebec. And I know I received a world-class education in French in Quebec. I have absolute confidence in that.
Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you. As
David,
someone who's not of a Quebecois heritage, it's really important.
not at all, not at all. I am not. I'm from New Jersey, and not at all that I know of, not at all of Franco-American heritage. But I was blessed to go to school as a grad and undergraduate in Quebec City, to go to school in French, to receive a wonderful education, as well as, of course, a wonderful, hospitable welcome, as an outsider, as an international student.
Thank you so much for saying that. It's really important. Really.
It's all true, all true. Now, we're really at the end of our time, but before we go, is there any additional thoughts that you'd like to share with us today?
Well, I'm just going to put in a plug for my book. It's called The Distinct Alien Race. You can get it on Amazon. You can order it from the publisher at barakabooks.com. Just Google my name and the title and you'll find it. You can order it from your favorite bookstore. I also have a blog that's called French North America. On Blogspot, it's FrenchNorthAmerica.blogspot.com. You can find me there. You can reach me by writing a comment on the blog. All the comments are moderated, so I see them before they go up there. I also have, a social media presence on Facebook. There's a Facebook group for my book that's just called The Distinct Alien Race. I'm on Twitter. I'm on other social media as well, so that's where you can find me. But I think it's immensely important that we reconnect with our Franco-American heritage and our identity, and then eventually also our language. This is a very important thing because it is an unknown thread. It's a very unusual story in North America. It's not quite like other North American stories. It's not like stories of immigration from Europe. It's got a different flavor to it. So just as a final thought, I just want to emphasize how important I think it is for people to learn about this. It's almost entirely unknown, even within the community, let alone outside of the community. So, I just want to put that plug in there about how important it is for us to reconnect to this.
So important, such an important message. If there is anybody out there who hasn't read your writing, hasn't read your book or your other writings, your blogs, your blog, your articles, your social media, I highly recommend them, could not recommend them more strongly.
Thank you, David.
David Vermette, thank you for spending time with us today. And thank you for everybody for listening. And I'll say to you, my favorite way to say goodbye in French, and that is à la prochaine. And I hope it will be soon. À la prochaine, David.
Steve, bye. Thank you so much.